and welcome to day 4 of my EVO session, which is looking at how to move from being a general English teacher to a business English trainer. And on day 4 I would like us to have a look together at the kind of materials which we can use in business English classrooms. Specifically looking at what's already available on the market, so ready-made materials, versus preparing authentic materials ourselves, what it involves, and the benefits and the drawbacks of both options. Okay, so let's have a look first of all at ready-made materials already available on the market. To give you examples of what I specifically mean by this, I'm thinking in terms of published books, but also books of photocopiable lessons for you to take and to use directly in the classroom. I'm thinking of teachers' resources. This may be a separate book which is available for people to buy, but it could be accompanying worksheets which are available often on publishers' websites. And finally, I'm thinking about downloadable worksheets, for example, the ones from the publisher's website, but also things which are made available by other teachers and trainers, for example, on blogs and personal websites. What are the benefits of using these kinds of materials? Well, they are structured. They're usually based on level, though they could be based on particular skills. That means it's easy to identify what we can do with them. They normally are very heavily focused towards practice activities, so we will get lots of input but also lots of output from these materials, and of course it involves low preparation. They're things which are readily available. There are, however, drawbacks, especially with books and published materials. There is clearly a cost involved. Even online materials, there are websites which require a fee per download. So obviously using other people's materials will incur higher costs than developing your own. One drawback is that they're not necessarily always of the best quality, or what we perceive to be the best quality. So there's a wide variety, especially when it comes to worksheets which have been developed by teachers and trainers and uploaded. We also need to think about how relevant the ready-made materials are to the goals of our learners. It's very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all worksheet or textbook to use in our business English training. And therefore many of the resources which are already available require some amount of modification on our part, whether this means leaving out exercises, whether it means supplementing the materials with extra exercises, or changing the focus of the exercise. So they are low preparation. Mostly they're very structured and very useful, but they do often require modification in order to meet the specific goals of business English learners. I've given you here some examples of books which you can use, which are very popular. Examples of websites with photocopiable lessons and some books. Intercultural Resource Pack is a book, Business Builder is a book. And downloadable worksheets, there are lots of publishers who make resources available online. One Stop English is a website which you can subscribe to with downloadable materials. It's also got a relatively new Business Spotlight section where you can download lessons directly based on articles in Business Spotlight. There are websites such as TEFLtastic and the BBC, and the British Council has an excellent website. You have the address there, Teaching English, and they have lots of downloadable materials which you can use. So I would recommend any of those, but of course this isn't an exclusive list, and these aren't necessarily the best materials available. They're things that you can try out and find out what works for you. So what are authentic business English materials? Well, they're materials which can be made available to you by your learners, by the company, by the person funding the course, which aren't prepared directly to be used as training materials, but which can be developed into training materials. So you can have a look here. There are all kinds of things which people can use. The internet will provide you with downloadable handbooks, manuals of products, Learners may give you tables and diagrams from reports which they have written or which they've received, photos themselves of products, services, areas of the organisation can be classed as business English materials in an authentic nature. Exhibition centres are a kind of authentic business English stimulus that people can use and which you can develop yourself into teaching and training materials. So there's a wide variety of things that people can offer you in organisations which you can exploit to target the learning objectives of the people in your class. Let's have a look now at why it's a good idea for us to use authentic business English materials. Well, one reason that they're useful is that they focus very, very much on the learner's needs. They're very individual and very relevant, which means that the chances of authentic business English materials targeting our specific learning objectives within our training are much higher than if we choose a book which has been made for a wide audience. We can also consider the learning styles of our clients when we're creating authentic business English materials. We can make them more visual, we can make them more hands-on, depending on how our learners like to practice language and how they like to learn. Because the materials are taken directly from the field in which they work, they are genuine, and you can create genuine tasks and genuine texts to practice during class, which stimulates real communication, the kind of communication that learners authentically need to take part in. And this is extremely motivating for our learners. It means that they're more highly engaged in what we're doing in class because the practice which we are giving them is very personal. When we're creating training materials from authentic materials of any kind, we need to make sure that the resource itself is relevant to the objectives which the learners stated at the beginning of the course and the needs analysis. So just because something comes from the industry or from the company in which the learner works doesn't always mean that it's a relevant resource. It needs to be something which will be helpful in targeting a particular skill or area of language. Of course, documents come in all lengths and all levels of difficulty. So first of all, we need to think, is the length of the text that we're looking at, or the length of the piece of listening, the video or the recording of a video conference, for example, is it a correct length? Or do we need to cut it down to size somehow? Or is it possibly too short in order to be able to stimulate the kind of language development that we're looking at? In terms of difficulty, is the language contained within the authentic material too easy or too difficult for the level? If it's too difficult, can we pre-teach the jargon or the terminology used? Or do we need to simplify the resource before we present it to the learners? All the time we need to bear in mind, what are the learning outcomes which we expect? When we choose a piece of authentic material to adapt to training materials, what are we wanting the learners to achieve? What do we want them to walk away from the class with and be able to apply directly to their work? And finally, when we take a piece of authentic material, how do we create practice activities? What kind of tasks do we need to be able to create? As an example, there are two very traditional approaches to teaching. One is the PPP approach, presentation, production and practice. If we take, for example, part of a business report, we can have a presentation stage where we introduce the key vocabulary that's going to be contained in the written text. We have a production exercise where participants are expected to formulate sentences or to use the vocabulary in the correct context, and then a practice exercise so that they can practice using the target vocabulary in a more free situation, so perhaps with conversation questions. An alternative is task-based learning, TBL. In this situation, we might have participants complete some kind of task, so for example, negotiate a delivery time. Then at the end of the task, we would ask them to report on what went well, what didn't go so well. This is part of an analysis, so they're analysing their own language use, but of course you as the trainer are also helping them to analyse areas in which they can improve. And once you have identified areas in which you can expand their language use or improve their language use, you create practice activities with them so that they can feed back your comments into the next session. And finally, to give you an example of how easy it is to create excellent business English training materials from authentic materials given to you, if you look at the final slide, you can see a very small exercise which I have created very quickly from a manual given to me by a group of students who produce machines for supermarkets which store bread for the customers who are shopping in the supermarket and want to select bread to take with them to the counter. And all I did very simply was to take the online manual and create some screenshots of different parts of the machine, and then I simplified the language used to describe the assembly of the machine. And using this, I first of all asked my participants if they can identify the parts of the machine just looking at the pictures. When they did, I gave them the sentences and asked them to identify which were the verbs in the sentences and explain or define what those verbs mean. And then I asked them to match a sentence with a picture, put the process in order, and then I removed the pictures and I removed the sentences, excuse me, and I asked the participants only looking at the pictures to go through the process again and use the verbs that they had looked at already to explain the process, the assembly process of this object. So it was something which took me perhaps 10 minutes to prepare, but which gave learners a very relevant exercise, a highly communicative and very personalised exercise to practice an objective which they had stated in their needs analysis, and a communicative skill which they need to be able to use every day in different communicative forms. So today we have talked about authentic exercises, and we have talked about exercises from ready-made teaching material sources. We've looked at the benefits and the drawbacks of both, and we've also looked at tips for creating training materials if you are given access to authentic materials from your learners or from the organisation where they work. Okay, that is the end of day 4, and there will be a small exercise for you to complete and to comment on after this session, and I will be with you again tomorrow for day 5, which is the last session of this week. Okay, so have an excellent afternoon and see you tomorrow.